Hey everyone, we're here with Mark Mangus, healthcare strategist at Red Hat, solution architect in a previous life, but right now really focusing on healthcare. And Mark, thanks for being here. First of all, welcome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Luca.
Yeah. So let's get right into it. I actually, you know, in your role as a healthcare strategist, I'm really curious because one thing that we have observed in the platform engineering world is that engineering organizations in regulated industries like healthcare, like financial services, like government, are obviously very used to this idea of security by design or having very defined, spaces that obviously we call golden paths in the platform engineering world, but really they're used to this idea of guardrails and having to, follow very clear templates that you can't really deviate from because people's money, people's lives might be at risk.
Mhm.
Um, so, so what's interesting here is while I think this security first approach has meant that organizations, especially IT organizations in these industries, have historically been on the back foot of a lot of trends in enterprise. When it comes to platform engineering, it seems they're all of a sudden find themselves in a more comfortable place where
Mhm.
everybody seems they're discovering now, hey, security by design is actually pretty sexy. And they're like, yeah, we've been doing this for 20 years. So how do you see platform engineering entering, if at all, the healthcare space? And I guess what is healthcare learning from platform engineering? And what can the platform engineering community learn on the flip side from healthcare?
Yeah, so that's a really good one because what I see every day out in the field with my customers is, they talk about secure by design and they are serious about security. I'm not implying they're not. But how it translates into action is in a very siloed kind of walled garden approach. And it's so onerous to do anything. Just keeping the lights on is a big job, right? So doing anything to change anything or innovate is it's almost a bridge too far for most of these organizations. And this is why they're they lag behind, right? It's because of the perceived risk, the need to protect health information, PHI, regulatory compliance issues, all these things, right? And so what ends up happening is they implement all these control gates, and so as they move something, a piece of infrastructure through its normal workflow, it looks like it's going through all these different control gates. I very rarely have ever seen any of these organizations, even big ones, multi-billion dollar companies, actually implement secure by design, meaning that there's an integrated workflow where all the things are happening as an integrated part, right? It's still a walled garden or throwing things over the wall to the next department and the next department and the next department. So I think where IDP and platform engineering holistically has a lot of appeal is it's kind of a prescription to do what most of them have wanted to do for a long time. And then it's just a matter of how do I implement this across a siloed organization? And unfortunately, they can't really follow the prescription unless they start making some wholesale changes to how they operate. And then you're fighting kind of the change management headwind of we've always done it this way and it's kept us safe. So why would we want to change? Well, I think the bigger headwind right now is AI. And most of these organizations don't know how to swallow it. Almost every company that I talk to, I would say every company that I talk to, is experimenting with AI. And what hasn't quite settled in yet is that this isn't like, the internet explosion around 2000. It isn't like any other wave of technological change. This is something that's going to touch every layer of the organization. At the same time, it's touching everybody culturally and all the consumer driven things. It's really changing everybody's mindset at a speed that nobody can really comprehend. So with this amazing thing that's happening, how do they adapt? I think platform engineering is a really good way to adapt to that change. But again, it's a big pill to swallow for these companies from the way that they've always done things. And they don't really know, most of them have not absorbed the fact that this wave of change is going to hit them and they can either benefit from it or it can, I mean, not to be too dire, but it can take them out. I think in 5 years, there'll be the healthcare companies that figured out what to do with AI and the rest will be gone. They'll either be
Right.
absorbed or they'll go out of business.
Right. Yeah. It's good. We made it like I think like 4 minutes into the conversation and before getting into AI. But I totally agree with you. I think I'm sure you've seen this like very dire, speaking of dire, like prediction of MIT, right? This MIT study that was talking about the fact that 95% of pilots they're seeing in the enterprise are failing, AI
Mhm.
pilots. There's been it's been since a little bit debunked as a study, and there's been other things that are like slightly more positive that are coming out. But I
Mhm.
think in general what you see across the board, at least what we're seeing in the community, is the things that are working are in terms of AI are where there are pre-existing platform setups that are somewhat working, because I think it's quite easy, with this AI stuff, to your point, right? It's touching so many different layers and so many different parts of the organizations where actually getting to a relatively impressive demo is
Mm.
really not that hard.
Right.
The hard thing is like, how do you go from day zero to day one, day two, day 100, which like we know in infrastructure, right, is that's where the real value is at
Yeah.
scale. Once you have standardized something and you're automated it, and then you move it to the next level, and it can really be adopted org wide, right? And and I think what we are seeing is once you do have some sort of platform engineering initiative in place, that becomes very natural because you're
Right.
used to look at things as like, okay, well, I have this platform layer and now I'm just adding this like AI workload on top or even this agentic workflow on top of it. And I'm just accelerating things, right? The problem is if you don't have that initial paved road, now all of a sudden, instead of having like a few people running over it, you have like a few people plus, 10,000 agents just like
Right.
storming it, and so it completely clogs everything. But so I guess like going back to the healthcare thing. So do you see healthcare companies have an advantage because of their history, because of their mindset of looking at things, to your point? Do they have an advantage in terms of reaching higher platform maturity and therefore unlocking bigger benefits from AI?
I don't think so. I think they're at a disadvantage because
Mm,
of again, the perceived risk and the regulatory compliance burden and all these things. Those are real. And
right.
for example, there's a whole raft of new CMS guidelines that are going to hit January 1st around prior authorization and making sure that critical claims for prior authorization are processed in 72 hours. Most payers can't do that today.
Right.
They just can't. So they've got all these institutionalized systems that have been in place for sometimes decades, or they're relegated to using functionality inside their claim system. So they're
Mhm.
beholden to the vendor. And so they're kind of running around with their hair on fire trying to figure out how do we comply with this. That's just one example of just trying to keep the lights on, as I was saying, keep the status quo and comply with what's happening. They don't yet realize that AI can be not only a help in doing some of these compliance activities, but there a lot of them are still thinking about it as like they've always thought about brownfield and greenfield development. Like it's a thing I need to build and push through this innovation workflow and deploy and support day two. What they don't yet understand is that you can use AI to do that too.
Mhm.
It's not the object, it's also the subject. It can be
Right.
integrated and drive the process. And you can actually use different techniques like agentic AI and adversarial AI to check your work as you go,
Right. Are you
right?
seeing any of that on the field right now?
Very little. It's still very solution oriented, right?
Mm.
I got to go build this thing because it's got a high value or high visibility or whatever. Or more likely, what's that?
For a specific use case, but not
Yeah,
necessarily looked at as a system of like, how do we
yeah.
build an AI-driven pipeline, for example, right?
Exactly. And they're
Mm.
still their buying motion, which is institutionalized, is still I have a problem. I'm going to go find a solution, a COTS system customized off the shelf, buy it, customize it to where it's a huge support burden because now I've got a custom version of it, and then cobble it together with all the other solutions I have and create a support burden, right, for my team.
Right.
They've been doing that on a wash, rinse, repeat basis for decades, right? And they're trying to do the same thing with AI. And
Mhm.
while they're doing that and they're solving a problem, might even be a big, high visibility, high value problem, but they're giving up their sovereignty. And some of the smarter ones, some of the smarter organizations are actually saying when, when the Epics or the Facets of the world that are coming, or Salesforce comes to them and says, oh, you don't have to worry about AI. We've got AI built into our product. Just use ours. I had one customer that kind of blew my mind how progressive that the statement was. They said, that's nice. Make sure that we can turn it off if we want to.
Uh-huh.
So they're starting to think about, how do I protect my sovereignty in making my own decisions in the best way for my organization around AI, protect my data the way that I want to, right? So this old motion and old thinking of, I'm just going to press the easy button and buy something off the shelf. It doesn't really fly anymore for AI.
It
It
doesn't.
can't, unless you
Well,
buy
and
something that you can integrate with everything else easily and is built on open standards.
yes.
Okay, now you're getting closer, right? But you can't kick the can down the road on that stuff anymore. You just can't.
That's super interesting. Yeah. I mean, it actually ties well into another trend that I'm seeing, which is, I think like in the last, I don't know what you think about it, right? But in the last 15, 20 years, we've essentially developed this sort of like, I call it SaaS industrial complex.
Mhm,
Where you have, similar to the military industrial complex, where you also have this like weird revolving door between the government and the military, right? And like all this thing, but there's like huge vested interest that essentially changes really the face of organizations, right? So, you mentioned Salesforce, for example. For a very large installation of Salesforce, you literally change the org chart for that, for parts of the organizations. You now have like, you know, I don't know, 10 people and maybe some director or VP that just does that essentially, right?
mhm,
And this happens all over the place for different SaaS, right? And so you now have certain companies, including, I'm sure, the large healthcare providers that you work with, right, that have this insane high bills
mhm,
for SaaS, right? It's like some cases CIOs are spending billions, like billions of dollars,
mhm.
right, on their bill. And it's like that's crazy. Like to think about that level of money, right? And on top of that, it has the huge org chart implications that we just mentioned. And I think like what's interesting is if you think about what really SaaS is sort of a minimum common denominator optimization at the end of the day, right? It's like, well, I'm optimizing for my 100, 2,000, whatever customers that I have as a SaaS provider and trying to make everyone decently happy, plus bundling a bunch of stuff that as soon as I'm big enough, bundling a bunch of stuff in that I don't really need, but that makes me money, right?
Yeah, right.
And so then you have this like really distorted incentives and essentially this like really bloated SaaS budget on the one hand and org charts, and then something that's not really customized and catered on the
Yeah.
other. And I see how do you see already people, because I think you made a really interesting point on, like people not wanting to apply that same business model essentially to AI because they
Mhm,
see it's like closer to their
mhm.
core capabilities as a business and is going to thwart their, opportunity moving forward. But then also, so you have that as one facet of this, but then the other facet is also the sort of like from what I'm seeing is also just like a lot of kind of agency like providers that are
Yeah,
coming in and being like, hey, dear CIO, your $2 billion a year budget a year, right? I can now take everything, build it for a few hundred millions, and it's a one off bill. And
mhm.
then it's going to be customized to you, right?
Right.
So, like, that's very interesting as well.
Yeah. That's kind of like the pendulum swinging between the two extremes, right? But very rarely there's a couple of dynamics at play, really. One is, yeah, the cloud bills are insane, and
Mhm.
that's why we're seeing um, a lot of repatriation happening where,
Mm,
you know, they're big companies are saying, "Oh, we're gonna close XYZ data centers 2, 3 years ago." Now they've put all that on hold, and they're reexamining, can we move some of our critical workloads back to our own data center, right? What has been a limitation there is hardware. You know, we've
right.
had so many supply chain problems coming out of COVID and other factors that have influenced that, that they literally can't buy enough servers and certainly not enough GPUs if they want to do AI, right? So that's starting to loosen up a little. So, you know, there's a balance point in there, right, between taking advantage of cloud services in the smartest, most optimal way possible, and then
Mhm.
having some things on-prem or in your data center. The problem is that most of the ways these infrastructure platforms are implemented today are bespoke. They're highly customized, highly optimized for whatever provider that, you know, gave them the best deal 5 years ago. um, GCP, Azure, AWS, whatever. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But they've gone in and done custom tooling and they've optimized all their processes around that platform. So
Right.
to move is like an act of God to make that happen, right? I mean, they're the definition of locked in.
Locked in.
So there's a hopefully a learning cycle that's happening because I know I see this at Red Hat where we talk about, you know, trying to sell our products, which are hybrid, that they give you a layer of abstraction so you can move things anywhere. And I'm not trying to have a sales pitch or anything. I'm just trying to differentiate. So a lot of companies look at that and they go, oh, that's too expensive and too complicated. We're just going to go with Azure. Right.
Right.
And then 2 or 3 years later, we talk to them. They're like, yeah, we spent $10 million on tooling and now we're locked in Azure.
Yeah.
Right, and we can't do anything else, and we've had a turnover cycle with our employees, and we've got new people, and it's a mess, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say Red Hat's the only solution, it's not. It's the thinking that's the problem. They're
It's the
not
thing.
thinking about, again, I'll use that word, sovereignty. How do I protect my ability to make the best decision for my company, not for the cloud provider,
Right.
and be able to run workloads and parts of my infrastructure wherever I want to? That's the best for me, right? Almost nobody thinks that way because they buy the message that the hyperscalers are giving them hook, line, and sinker, that we're the best provider of these services and we're going to give you the best financial deal. And I've even heard of CIOs getting fired for not taking a deal from Google or somebody
Really?
because they're low, you know, their technique is they lowball you by hundreds of millions of dollars to get you into a 5-year contract, and then the 5 years comes up and you're back up to full price, right? And they
Right.
have a much harder time getting out. So all of this to kind of come back around to platform engineering as a prescription and a model for operating, but also as it filters down into how do I build, you know, best practices driven, value driven platform. If you kind of step back and look at what's the best way to do that, set my investment aside for a minute. Is there a future vision that I can develop for my company that gives me some of these attributes of, you know, independence and hybrid and moving things between the data center and cloud? The answer is yes, there is. It exists and people are doing it. Maybe not
Yeah.
in the healthcare industry very much, but in other industries they are. So there's a lot that can be learned from looking at how other people do things in other industries
Mhm.
and not solving problems that don't need to be solved because people have already figured it out, just not your peers. So look outside the fence and go out and look at what other people are doing and you'll be shocked.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and I totally agree. You know, some of the most advanced platform setups I've seen are the ones that are even capable, like live, right? To say, well, we're going to move this workload from, you know, this setup to that setup, from this cloud to that cloud, or from cloud to in-house, your point, right?
Yeah,
Like there's a big push from like, hey, cloud, cloud, cloud to like, well, actually hybrid, and really are able in real time to just like switch over, just
right,
depending on the costs on, you know, and then like your point, these are providers. There shouldn't be your rulers, right? You
right.
shouldn't sovereignty over
Right.
like, a 3, 5 year contract just because they lowballed you, to your point. It's super interesting. So I guess like, you mentioned like um what what we can learn from our industries. I want to double click on that in a second, but so would you say, is there anything, I'm going to give you one last chance.
Mhm.
Is there anything that other industries can learn from healthcare, or really, healthcare is desperately behind and they can only, they're the ones that still have to do all the catch up and learning from others?
Well, 2 things can be true, right? There are pockets of innovation in healthcare that are
Mhm.
really exciting. Um, in the general sense, yeah, healthcare is still far
Yeah.
behind, right?
Yeah.
But the pockets of innovation that are really exciting are the ones where they're really focused on patient outcomes, and they're really looking at how do we use AI to drive patient outcomes.
Mm.
Um, it sounds kind of weird to say it this way, but some of the most exciting areas of innovation are the ones that are in the back office dealing with data,
Mhm.
because there's so much toil and drudgery in healthcare
Right.
just dealing with data, translating data between payer, provider, between different data formats. It's never in the right format for the person that needs it at the right time, basically.
Right.
Or the workflow is closed and it's part of a closed system, stuff like that. Well, all that filters down to the patient encounter between the doctor and the patient. And if the doctor can't get what they need when they need it, patient care suffers. If the prior authorizations can't be processed fast enough, then patient care suffers. All those types of things, right? And those are data driven.
Mhm.
So what's really exciting about AI, just kind of one general area, just to mention one, is, in the past, all of these data transformation and data integration and API gateways and all those kinds of things are rule driven. They're
Mhm.
very stochastic in how they move data through the system, right? AI provides a different approach where you can say, I'm starting with this format and I want to end with this format. Figure it out. There are no
Right.
rule systems, right?
Right.
But what one of the things generative AI, for example, is really good, is translating between one known state and another known state,
Yeah.
right? In the middle, I mean, you do need traceability and you do need transparency, and you can set it up that way. Don't get me wrong. But you don't have to explicitly go in and go, follow these 21 steps to
Predefine
translate
everything.
the data, right? And that's the
Yeah.
past we're coming from.
Yeah.
So there's a sea change coming around that area in healthcare that's going to make everything so much faster and so much better. And oh, by the way, people, we talk about, AI taking human jobs. Humans don't want these jobs.
Right.
This is
Yeah.
terrible work, right? It's so prone to human error and it's so tedious, right?
Yeah.
Humans don't want these jobs. So all of the decades of healthcare data that's sitting out there that is basically has no value, it's just being stored.
Just dumb
We
data.
can
Yeah.
get AI to go in there and start wringing value out of it
Yeah.
in lots of different ways. So that's one area that really excites me, but it's not the sexy, algorithm that's out on the front line in a clinical workflow. That stuff, I still think you need to have a human in the middle always. And it's fine to have an AI advisor that says, "Hey doc, I just looked at the longitudinal patient record for the last 20 years and make sure you ask about these things." That's
Mhm.
fine, right?
Yeah.
Totally fine. But
Yeah.
that's what usually our people are kind of thinking more of those use cases. But I think the revolution, if you will, if I can use that word, is really around handling data and
Yeah.
getting value
Well,
from data.
absolutely. And I mean, like, so often at the end of the day, what we say is like, whatever the input goes there goes the output, right? Like if it's like trash in, trash out, if
Mhm.
it's like good stuff in, good stuff out, right? And so like that ETL part and that like, cleaning all this, this like, to your point, boring stuff is
Mhm.
really the necessary requirement for quality at the
Yeah.
end of the day on the sexy like front end use cases. And so that's really interesting. So essentially what you're saying is, because there's just so much data and because there's so many steps and so much pain in
Mhm.
this, like all these different formats, different providers in healthcare, actually healthcare can be a first mover in this
Yeah.
sense, just because the level of pain is so high. Even
Right.
if they're slow, that's where
Yeah.
they're already going with
Yeah.
this AI translation, right? Between
Yeah.
different formats and so on.
Yeah. And we went through, I think we're still in it, but we went through, maybe 10 years ago, a little longer, this big age of data and analytics, right before the AI wave really hit. And that was really useful because we could start using tools for population health to look at large data sets over a long amount of time and say, these patients are healthy and these patients are not. These are the ones that are costing us a lot of money, you know, payer and provider, both sides, right? So what can we do? What analysis can we do to give us detailed demographics on those patients, all their comorbidities and all the different things that are wrong with
Right.
them, and the different types of care that they need? What can we do to improve our system so that we serve the unhealthiest patients better, right? Because they're the ones that are costing the most. That was great, but it's kind of showing its age now, those systems, right? Because again, they're rule based,
Hmm.
right? They don't figure things out. But the interesting thing that we can do now is we can take a lot of the learning from that era and from those tools, and we can feed that into generative AI with
Right.
control gates and boundaries and techniques like agentic AI and adversarial AI and different things. And we can leap forward to the next age, which is now we can really make this thing sing and dance in terms of finding new patterns and new data that we haven't even thought of
Hmm.
that might be
Hmm.
driving costs up and patient outcomes down, right? That we're just baby stepping into that era
Yeah.
now. But there were billions of dollars spent on all that data and analytics infrastructure and tools. And those companies are desperately trying to retool and get into the AI age.
Rebrand.
Yeah, rebrand, exactly. So again, it's all about sound like a broken record, but it's all about the data. And that's
100%.
really where the innovation happens, is better ways to handle the data and more current, right? So there's also the old world, the rule-based world is everything's in batch. You know,
Right.
I have something, I convert it into another format or deliver it to other places, and all this stuff happens overnight, over days, whatever. Gen AI is going to get us much closer to where things are happening in real
Real
time
time.
or near real time, where the decisions need to be made when the decisions need to be made.
Yeah. 100%. Um, you mentioned a couple times now this, it's kind of like, okay, we're going from this like rule-based system to this, you know, eh, Gen AI, right? Ultimately probabilistic driven,
Mhm.
right? Sort of system. And we have this adversarial AIs, agentic AIs that you're talking about. Where do you see, I'm curious on the field, like top performers differentiate versus the rest of the pack in the way they're thinking about these systems that we've kind of mentioned? Because one interesting thing, I remember when I was at Google Next this year and everything was about AI, of course, and I met a couple of enterprises across different industries, and most people were just talking about it, right? Nobody was like really doing anything. And then you meet a couple of people and they're like, man, like they're already like pushing a lot of stuff to prod, like pretty wild stuff.
Mhm.
And one pattern that I saw there that was interesting was actually like how they were like embracing all the techniques that you're talking about, like adversarial AI, and really just like thinking of this as like pretty
Mhm.
complex pipeline, kind of chain one after the other, but without giving up entirely on the old world. Meaning,
Sure.
hey, we already have all these rules and all this stuff. Like, we don't
Mhm.
have to throw those away. We know those are
Right.
like fine. A lot of stuff, right? A lot of times. The problem is like you pointed out, is like if you always have to have everything predefined, then it becomes really hard to be real time and to
Yeah.
move fast, right? But and so, how do you see people combining, the old with the new? Because I think that's where a lot of the real competitive advantage can come from. To your
Right.
point, not have the pendulum swing like massively one
Mhm.
way to the other, but like how do you find the right balance?
I think it's really kind of going back to something I said early on, which is looking at AI differently. AI isn't like when people went to cloud, they thought, "Oh, this is a fancy server,"
Hmm.
and they treated it exactly the same way as when they
Right,
bought servers and installed them in racks, right? Even though
right,
there were all these rich, robust services around it and they could start to decompose their application monoliths and all the things, they didn't. They just
right.
lifted and shifted, right? That lift and shift kind of mentality is still operating in the AI world where they're thinking, oh, this is a faster, better way to code or
Mhm.
use technology. So I'm going to have a faster, better program. What they're not getting is that you can use it in a self recursive way to
Right.
optimize itself and optimize the platform they're using to deliver the solution and then also use it in the solution,
Right.
right? It's the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's looking at the whole thing holistically. And the people that you mentioned that are get it and are doing that are the ones that are they're not just finding cool answers to hard problems. They're setting themselves up for operating differently in the future. And the next problem and the next problem and the next problem are going to be that much easier to solve because they're using AI in the right way. The other thing is people don't realize they get really freaked out. The people that really don't understand kind of the underpinnings of how AI works, they get freaked out
Right.
about, AI is going to take over the world and all this kind of stuff. But in these solution scenarios and infrastructure scenarios, the adversarial part and the agentic part really come into play to have AI monitor itself,
Mm.
where you're always challenging the quality of the output at each workflow step, right? And you're always having smaller AIs that are optimized for one thing, and they're really smart about that one thing.
Right.
And then you have groups of those, each one of them are smart about a different thing.
Right.
That's the agentic part. And in that agentic mix, you have these adversarial agents that are checking the quality of the output of all the other agents and maybe summarizing it and maybe translating it for a specific purpose or that kind of thing. So you have to get out of this monolithic thinking of AI as a thing. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna take Chat GPT and I'm gonna make it sing and dance and solve problems. That's
Yeah.
not really how it works in the real world.
Right.
And the right way to do it, at least right now, and it's changing rapidly, right? But the right thing seems to be having kind of like AI minions, a bunch of little ones that know how to do specific things and are all kind of communicating and collaborating according to the rules that you set up. And then they're producing that quality output. And it also gets you away from this huge burden of having to take a massive data set and a massive frontier model, like an AI
Mm.
model, and train it on that data, which, could cost millions of dollars, just the training, right? In a lot of these scenarios that we get into that solve specific problems, you don't have to do any training because you're setting up custom data sets, retrieval augmented generation, right? You're setting up custom data sets and small LLMs that are trained on or just look at that one data set.
Right.
And there isn't really a lot of optimization necessary. But the cool thing is if you build the infrastructure right, you can mix and match. You can have some things that are trained on data, some things that are using RAG, some things that are using other things, and they're all
Right.
collaborating in the same, pool, if you will, to provide an answer. So I hope I didn't go too deep on the technology side, but that's just an example of how the people that are getting stuff done with AI and they're actually deriving value from it and managing it day two, these are kind of the things that they're doing.
No, I love this. And I really love the parallel that you drew between cloud, right? And AI now, and how really the people that did cloud well, first of all, probably need to move everything over
Yeah,
to
right.
cloud right away, like we said earlier, but then also really looked at this as an opportunity to architect things in a different way instead of just like lift and shift on a different platform. And here's the same thing. It's like, well, you can actually have different modular components, in this case, agents, interact with one another in a completely novel way that unlocks completely novel opportunities, really,
Right.
both on the technical front, like you mentioned, and obviously, as a derivative of that on the business side of things, right?
Hmm.
And it's actually, I was having this conversation the other day, with somebody that was, we mentioned rebranding earlier, that was kind of talking about how this opens up this opportunity for a type of engineer, but broadly I think of a sub-discipline of
Hmm.
engineering, which has been like QAing, right?
Hmm.
Which is not being the sexiest thing and like on the, on the on the forefront, and more like kind of like, oh, this sort of like necessary evil, but the real artists, the real
Mhm.
10xers are the ones actually creating the code and everything. And it's interesting where in a world where, you know uh the generating of the code and the features and so on, the cost basically goes to zero.
Mhm.
It's really like, well, how do you architect the checks and balances, to your
Right.
point, right? And so like QA all of a sudden becomes a sexy thing, which actually is like, well, that's actually how you again go from like nice, sort of demo to actually, well, day 100, scalable implementation.
Yeah, an example of that, I think, is where we're at today with vibe coding.
Mhm, mhm.
It's a real hot, sexy topic right now, right?
Right,
And everybody can code now, right?
right.
But it's a point in time problem, I will admit, as I talk about this, because in another year we won't be talking about this. But right
Mhm,
now, what we have as kind of the general state of the art with vibe coding is all the biases of generative AI that come into play. The bias to please you, the bias to get the job done however it needs to get done. These kinds of things come in and really bring down the code quality
mhm.
to the point where something that you generate with vibe coding might be great for a proof of concept, but it's not okay for day two operation, right? It
Right.
doesn't have all the checks and balances built into it. Security, architecture, failover, disaster recovery, all these types of things are not built into it. Even if you ask it to, it can still hallucinate and come up with really bizarre scenarios for the code. That's not really what it's for. Tools now are starting to emerge that are incorporating techniques of doing things like training on, tens of thousands of programs of a certain type that are well written. So it's not looking at the entire universe of code to give you a solution. It's looking at a curated set of code. And when you go in as a developer to correct something or change or add a module or whatever you do to make that a well-structured program, it actually watches that and it adds it to the training set. And so as you go forward, it gets better and better at,
Keeps improving.
doing the robust day two code, right? But that's just, I say all that to say that's an example of what you're talking about. But AI is changing so fast, and the techniques for using AI are changing so fast that a lot of these issues that we're having now with hallucinations and quality and different things are kind of taking care of themselves. We're evolving out of it. It's gonna happen in a different way in a year, in 2 years, 3 years.
100%.
I can't even tell you what's gonna happen in 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah.
Some of the pundits are talking about artificial general intelligence in that time frame. So we'll see. But right now, I think the focus needs to be on deriving value from AI. And one of the best ways to do that is to follow a prescriptive path like platform
Mhm.
engineering to make sure that you're looking at the problem holistically and you're using things in a way and designing things in a way, processes, people, and technology,
Right.
so that you maintain your own sovereignty and your agility to move in different directions. And where healthcare has come from and still is their big vendors set their strategy. They don't.
Right.
The
Right.
Epics of the world, right? The Cerners of the world. They're the ones that, they spend so much money on this platform. A, there's not much left over for anything else.
Right.
But
Right.
also, they have to make sure that their whole ecosystem is centered around the sun that is that vendor. And so they get AI from them, right?
Yeah.
And it's ultimately not a great situation strategically. So this is where we need to evolve. And it's not just healthcare. There's a lot of industries that kind of fall into this same trap, right?
100%. And that's where I think, like we said, right? I think, in the last 5, 10 years have been a lot of trends in enterprise, whether in healthcare or across any industry, that we've kind of lived through in the last decade or so. And it seems that kind of AI has come to rule them all and is sort of like overshadowed a lot of them. I actually think it's really turbocharging platform engineering in that sense,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
your point, the people, I think people are recognizing some of these anti-patterns that we've seen before around sovereignty, around
Mhm.
control of data, around ownership. And they're like, not this time, not this time, because this time really matters. And nobody can really
Mhm.
afford to screw it up, to your point. Like, this is really going to be the defining watershed moment, I think, between losers and winners in a lot of industries,
Mhm.
from healthcare to anywhere else.
Mhm.
And the I think future winners are recognizing the need for platform engineering or for platforms to really make use of this AI properly and, to your point, guarantee their sovereignty. So I think very interesting time to be alive and working in this industry. And thanks, Mark, for your time and insights. I'm looking forward to catching up again in 6 or 12 months from now and see see where we're going to be at then.
Yeah, that would be fun. Let's do that because it's changing so fast. I don't even know what it's going to look like in 12 months.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Mark, thanks so much for the time. See you next time.